Well, welcome to another week's analysis behind the news. This morning we see in the Wall Street Journal that Egypt may charge foreign workers. We've been discussing this over the last few weeks about certain organizations led by members of the Council on Foreign Relations, NGOs they're called, are interfering in Egyptian politics, and the Egyptian military government doesn't like that, which should come as no surprise, really. An NGO is something that you've got to really look at. It's injected in these articles, but most people that just goes over their head. What does that mean, non-government organization? What that means is an NGO is affiliated with the United Nations. Now go to the website of the United Nations and look up NGOs, and you'll discover that to be a part of be an NGO means that you are really abiding by the principles and the goals, etc., of the United Nations. Go take a look at it for yourself. Then find out if your conservative organization is an NGO. That might surprise you after you read what they supposedly stand for on the UN website and what they tell you in their newsletters and so on and so forth. The United Nations is working for a one-world government to do away with the independence of the American people and the Constitution of the United States. We cannot abide going into an international organization and still keep our Constitution. It won't work. And anyone who's studied the United Nations Charter, anyone who's studied the Constitution at the same time, knows that they cannot work together. Just impossible. Aside from the fact that we would no longer be independent and being able to unilaterally make our own decisions, which we should be capable of doing. But at any rate, take a look at these things in regard to what you're involved in. You may find out that your involvement is perhaps been misled. The other thing is that I noticed in the paper this morning is that Obama, bless his heart, has nominated an administrator or a manager for J.B. Morgan to be selected on the board of the FDIC. Now, that's the organization that they tax the banks to pay so much per month, so much per quarter, into the federal government as insurance, federal deposit insurance. And that way, if that bank goes under, then you see the depositor I think it's up to $200,000 now. It was $100,000 for a long time. It gets reimbursed out of that fund, that insurance, for his deposits. Now it's only $200,000 per depositor. So if you've got $250,000, you're out $50,000. If you've got a CD in there or something of that nature. The problem is that so many banks have gone under that the FDIC is really caught short. And so they tax the banks more and more for this insurance. So the bad banks cause a bigger premium for the good banks. So because of these premiums, the good banks become bad banks because they can't afford the premiums. It's that simple. Now, I've talked to a couple of friends of mine who are no longer in the banking business. One sold out before it was too late, and the other guy just lost his bank. And one of the reasons was they couldn't afford these high premiums. And they had no choice, by the way. It is a regulation that is arbitrary, set the price. You have to pay it or you don't get this insurance. You don't get this insurance, you can't keep your doors open. That's simple. So they've got these small family-owned, small investor banks over a barrel with this stuff. But not to worry, J.P. Morgan's bankers are coming to the rescue and serving on the board. Now, as part of the reason for these broadcasts is to give a little bit of insight to it. Now, really, in the long run, there's only going to be one bank in the sky, and Morgan and Company wants themselves to be that bank, in league with the government, obviously. So when you see that these regulators, these chairmen and everything come from these big banks, it's a clue that ultimately your neighborhood bank is going to disappear. Now, maybe not next week, maybe not next year, but a lot of them have disappeared in the last year, in the next decade, next 2 decades. Who knows how long it will take. But ultimately, they want one bank so the government won't have a problem in regulating that one bank. And in that regard, most of these big corporations love government regulation. Now, why do they love it? Because they can absorb it. They can zigzag. They've got plenty of people to work the problem, and they've got mega bucks to work the problem. But little guys can't. Let me give you one example. You've got the Weyerhaeusers of the world in the lumber industry. They just love regulation because it put their competition out of, just put them out of business. You know, most of you won't even understand what I'm talking about, and I'm going to mention the word teepee. Now, you'll all think that, well, that's the Sioux Nation out there on the prairies with their buffalo hides, and they've formed a teepee that they live in. But it used to be that there were many, many hundreds, if not thousands, and I believe that it was thousands, not maybe 50 years ago, of small independent lumbermen that would go out and chop down a tree, take it to a sawmill, saw it up for lumber, and part of the process to get rid of all the sawdust and the boards, the slag off of making these pieces of lumber, like irregular pieces of bark, so on and so forth, they'd throw into what they called a teepee burner. And this burner was shaped out of a steel, sheet steel, and a fire would be burning in there, and they just throw this stuff in there, and then at the top they had a mesh to make sure that sparks didn't get out and put the forest on fire. And these were called teepees. Well, we can't have that, so the government regulated against those things after we'd had them for a couple of hundred years, and put these little guys out of business because they couldn't afford to get rid of the slag and other regulations. It just made Weyerhaeuser that much more comfortable without all the competition. And whether it's Georgia Pacific or Weyerhaeuser or whomever, have you noticed that the price of lumber, for those of you who use lumber, has gone way high? It's because of that. There's no competition anymore. You just got the big boys on the block. The little guys have been put out of business, and they plan on doing that with the banks as well. Another thing that's happened, and it's something you should think about, and I don't have the answer to this. I'm just putting it out there for you to sort of mull it over for a bit. You know, China and Russia has voted against the resolution against Syria. Now, you might ask the question, well, why didn't they do it with Libya? Why didn't they do it with Iraq? Why didn't they do it with Afghanistan? Well, apparently Syria is one of the biggest customers of Russian military weapons. But so was Libya, so was Iraq, etc. Now, why did they do it particularly for Syria? I don't know. But I do know this, that at any time they want, Russia and China can block what the UN does through a veto on the Security Council. Remember the war called Korean War? There was this big show business that was put on for the consumption of the American people, where Khrushchev was banging his shoe on the desk of his desk at the General Assembly in the United Nations. Ultimately, when the resolution came up for going into South Korea to protect South Korea from the communist invasion from the north with all this Russian equipment, Russian training, Russian officers even working in the North Korean Air Force, etc., all of a sudden, Russia gets up and leaves the Security Council. They got mad. And what a wonderful opportunity, everybody said. The Russians left. They can't veto us going in there and saving South Korea. Now, why did they do that? Just think about it logically for a minute. They could have prevented us from going into, prevented us from them taking over South Korea, from the Russian satellite taking over South Korea. So why would they not want to veto the United Nations, meaning us primarily, going in there to save South Korea? Well, it was sold as show business of, oh, they got mad and they made a mistake. I don't think so. You know, these people are not stupid. Sometimes we are, but they aren't very stupid when it comes to war and international diplomacy and so on and so forth. So why did they do this in Korea? Allow us to go in there and have this war for what end? Other than just simply having a nice little war, killing 50,000 American boys and English and French and Turkish, etc., all the troops that were there under the aegis of the United Nations. But they didn't do it with Iraq, one of the biggest customers of Russian tanks and air power. They didn't do it with, again, with Afghanistan. And they didn't do it with Libya, one of the biggest customers for Russian military stuff. Now they're doing it with Syria. Just something to sort of mull around in your mind and ask the question, why not? And kind of read what happens, notice what happens in the future with that in regard. What are they doing? What are they planning? What have they got in mind? Something to really think about. Got some ideas. A little premature to talk to you about them this week at least. Until next week, we'll see you then.